Hooroo, coming at you from an L-shaped flat in Stones Corner, Queensland. This is Gimme Empathy. I'm Scott Mercer, and on this episode I have two guests, Craig Garrett and Shona Hawkes. They're two people I know through 4ZZZ, which is the community radio station I volunteer at. Last December, Craig, Shona, myself, and a few other people were all put together on a team sent out to the Woodford Folk Festival to cover it for the station. So we were charged with putting together a series of pre-recorded broadcast packages. So we went around interviewing artists, musicians, festival goers, interesting people like that, and recording bands and putting it all together and then sending it back to the station to go out on the radio and across the community radio network. And it was a big job and like a lot of work, but you know, you get free tickets to Woodford, and it's a really fun experience. I've done it a few times before, and on the way up to Woodford, I got to talking to Shona initially about the time that she and Craig had spent in Timor-Leste, or East Timor. It's a really, really interesting story, and Craig and Shona they're not the regular guests for this podcast. They've had very interesting lives they've been involved in. They've worked in the arts, in media, in activism, in journalism. And they're just very interesting people who think a lot about the world and their impact on it. So it was great to sit down and chat with them. We did record this interview in a different room in my house to normal. We recorded in the sunroom because my neighbour was playing loud music that was bleeding into the lounge room. So because it's closer to the road, you will hear a bit of bird song, some traffic noise, and dogs barking occasionally. Sorry about that. Righto, this is episode 53 of Gimme Empathy with Craig Garrett and Shona Hawkes.
No, you were there a good 3.
Oh, that's
least.
right. Yeah. I was there for a couple of months before you.
Yeah. So what happened? Shona got the job in Timor.
What was the job?
So I was working as a researcher. This is a bit of backstory for a group called Lau Hamatuk. And they'd been set up in 2000 when a set of international activists met with a set of Timorese activists and said, hey, we supported you during your struggle for freedom. What can we do now? And basically the Timorese activists said, we've been shut off from the world for 24 years. The UN's running our government. The World Bank's setting our economic policy. The IMF's setting our financial policy. And we have no idea who any of these people are. And so they basically set up a sort of part investigative journalism, part think tank, part sort of activist organisation that really tried to monitor and report on a lot of what the international presence in Timor was doing.
I was going to say also part watchdog.
Part watchdog, yeah. Yeah, so I'd gone to Timor the year before as a volunteer election observer, and I just thought Hamatuk were awesome. And I'd tried to volunteer with them and they said no, and then I just kept turning up anyway. And then they invited me to apply for a job. So I was there as part of their sort of agriculture team, so doing research and activism kind of in that area.
Did you have like a background in what they were looking for?
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to think of...
Directly before, though, you were working for the RMIT investigative place. Was it the Nautilus Centre? Yeah,
so I kind of kicked around doing various bits and pieces, research, policy, advocacy, activism. So basically a lot of what my job has been is basically just, if you're talking about agriculture, talk to farmers. If you're talking about youth, talk to young people. Like that's basically been my career, has been like telling people in various ways, talk to farmers or talk to the people who are affected by the decisions that you're making. So I'd done a few things. I've been working with an activist friend of mine at Monash University doing some research into agricultural policy. I had a background. I'd worked for a couple of years with the Tasmanian Youth Network of Tasmania. So that was basically the statewide youth network. So again, that was just talk to young people. So I had kind of like a bit of background in research and a bit of background in advocacy and supporting people who were affected by certain decisions to have a voice in those processes. So, yeah, it was kind of... And then I've been doing Timor stuff for probably about 2 years, so I've been quite involved in activist networks in Melbourne as well.
And so did you two know each other before Timor?
We did.
How did you meet?
You can tell the story.
Since about... So when did we meet? What year would we have met?
Don't you know?
No. I'm no good with dates.
Was it... I think it was 2000... It was the G20 in Melbourne. So when was that?
Whenever that was.
2006?
2006, 2007. Yeah.
2006, I think it was.
Okay. So since about 2001, that's why I was asking, I'd been doing different type of volunteer work in Melbourne, doing stuff that we kind of now call human rights and legal observation. And that was with a group called Pachang that no longer exists. But there's a group in Melbourne called the Melbourne Activist Legal Service, MALS, and they do really similar types of work. So what we would do is at something like the World Economic Forum in 2000, or the G20 in 2006, we would do this sort of legal observation work where we don't necessarily have any legal or official role or presence or protections, but we would turn up as people involved in the protest, but we would be observing. So we'd literally have clipboards and fluorescent vests, and we would be observers to ensure that police didn't overstep their authority. And if they did, we were actually there to observe, and sometimes just watching people changes their behaviour. Or the other thing we could do, and we'd done a lot of work with some of the community legal centres in Melbourne to create witness statement pro formas, and we'd take witness statements and then we would give that as evidence of police overstepping the mark or police being aggressive or police being violent.
Isn't this kind of supposed to be the role of the press? Like if you're a reporter and like covering a protest or something, isn't part of your job to observe all this? And I guess your presence as the fourth estate is also to keep, the cops in line to an extent? Or is I guess was this maybe more like a proactive organisation?
Yeah, look, this is the type of thing that is born out of. I mean, they did it in Timor as well. This is people in the organisations and the groups who are, if you like, protesting, looking at community safety, looking at... I guess everybody's biased. The media's not always going to be there. The media's not necessarily going to be on the ground. The idea of Pachang and its international kind of sister organisation, Peace Brigades International, is to actually make space for peace. Right. The reason I bring Peace Brigades International into it is that organisation, as an activist organisation, their role often is to be invited into countries where people's human rights are being violated. So other activist organisations, say in Indonesia or places like Honduras, where people are fighting the big fight to retain their land, to retain certain rights. And we know over the years that these activists have at times been threatened, have at times been physically assaulted, have at times been murdered. And what Peace Brigades International does on an international level is literally just hangs out with other activists and tries to let them do what they do by being an international set of eyes with an international network of people who can tell the media what's going on, but who can tell other activists what's going on.
Right.
So I've known people who've been in Palestine, and what they do is they bear witness to what is going on. And so Pachang and MALS bears witness to what's going on in a very particular way. For example, at the G20, I was at the Melbourne Museum. There was about 12, maybe 20, maybe 30 protesters protesting outside the museum, and like 50, 60, 100 police came in and did a baton charge.
Wow.
And so I saw that. I bore witness to that. I actually, my notes and the witness statements that I took from that ended up going to the Office of Police Integrity, and as an organisation, we made a complaint against the police for what they'd done that day. I think a young woman had her ribs broken from the baton charge. Now, there was an investigation and it was found that nobody did anything wrong.
The police found that they had done nothing wrong.
The police investigated themselves and found they did nothing wrong. Yeah, so that's the type of work that I'd been doing since about 2001. For the G20, Shona came and did some training with Pachang, and then we did that human rights legal observation stuff during the protests at the 2006 G20.
But we didn't actually do it together. That was just...
We didn't do it together.
Yeah.
I did a shift and then handed over to you, and I can't remember who you were doing your shift with. But
Michelle, I think. I think it was just after the Black Bloc had trashed a divvy van, and then someone had set up a puppet show right in front of it to calm down the crowd.
Yeah. So the Black Bloc had come in, or a Black Bloc had come in, turned over a police armoured divvy van type thing, and which obviously meant that the crowd and the police were kind of angsty. And so, yes, someone had set up a puppet show in between the two lines to try and just de-escalate the situation. And at that point, my shift finished and your shift started.
How successful was the de-escalation by the puppet show?
Yeah, it worked.
It did?
Yep. Yeah. And there was also at that point in time, I think, this might be the same person, we might be thinking about the same person, but someone did, I think, do a circus-y type performance as well between the two. I've seen someone do a circus performance kind of doing kind of backflips and stuff like that between the two lines of...
I remember there were people who were kind of dressed up almost like if you had someone doing clowning and policing, and they were kind of dancing on the front lines, and
Maybe
they did a lot to
thinking of.
de-escalate stuff as well. Yeah.
Do you see that a lot at demonstrations? People there just to de-escalate things?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Certainly at S11, the 2000 World Economic Forum protests, there were a lot of people there who brought comedy and satire and performance to the protest. Admittedly, a lot of the media focused on, and this happened as well, focused on the clashes between police and protesters, because there were 2 or 3 specific areas where the delegates could get into the casino and get out of. And so particular groups of people decided to go there and protest and block those entrances and exits. So a lot of the media focused on that, which the media needs that sort of tension, needs that sort of conflict to work. That's the fundamental way in which our kind of news media works. But around it all, there were a huge amount of affinity groups. There were groups from all across Australia, and there were people there who were dressed up like clowns. There were people who were dressed up like Santa Clauses. People against Monsanto, like the Santa Clauses against Monsanto. You know, like there were plays on words. There was just all manner of different ways of protesting. But there were people who were taking direct action, because I think there were like 4 ways to get in and out of the casino. So they were running the World Economic Forum thing in the casino, and so they made it really easy to blockade.
So you met at the G20 protests as part of different groups working together. And then, how soon after that did you go to Timor, Shona?
So you went in 2008.
Yeah, I think we'd been together about 18 months when I went. I went for the first time probably about 6 months afterwards, just for 5 weeks. And then, it was probably about 18 months afterwards that we moved to Timor.
Yeah, and so the original reason why we're telling this background is because you went to Timor first, a little bit before me.
You had something very important to do.
I had to go to Canberra because my sister was going to give birth to my niece.
Ah.
So I had to stay in Australia for about 3 months longer, 3 or maybe 6 months longer, 3 to 6 months longer than Shona did, so that I tied up all my loose ends in Melbourne and then moved to Canberra for I think a month or 6 weeks or something like that. And my niece was born, and that way I got to meet her a few hours after she was born. So yeah, that was exciting.
So Shona, was it hard moving to Timor on your own? Like, did you have much of a support network on the ground already, like in the organisation you were with?
Yeah. I'd been working in Melbourne for an organisation that had called East Timor Women Australia, that had a sort of a solidarity connection with a women's group in the east of Timor. And it was set up by someone she was a seamstress, and the connection was with weavers, because weaving's not really an artistic form that's really valued in Australia, but in Timor it's incredible. They're incredibly skilled women. And so they were basically setting up a social enterprise. So I was kind of working with them a little bit, and then I'd been quite involved in some of the other Solidarity Timor networks. And in some ways I think life in Timor or places like Timor makes a lot more sense to me than in Australia. So, in Timor, as a foreigner, I was getting a local wage, but, that local wage was in the top 1% of what people were earning. So, you have your job, you have a roof over your head, you have some food, you have kind of all the things that you need as a human. But then in Australia, there's a lot of, it's very easy to be overstimulated. We're almost drowning in choice and possibility. And it's quite hard to distinguish between the things that are important and the things that are less important. And so in Timor, it was much easier to see that in process. And so, there's a few little quirks that took a while to sort out. Like, I got quite bad food poisoning because I was shopping at the wrong local market stall. But yeah, the locals told me where was good and where wasn't good. All the usual stuff when you move somewhere.
Was that the first time you'd lived overseas?
No. So I'd lived overseas a few times actually. When I was 14, my parents are teachers, and my dad's a high school teacher, and there was a visiting teacher from France at his school in Dandenong in Melbourne. And so, yeah, Dad's friend basically said, "Oh, if Shona wants to come and stay with us for 6 months and learn the language." So I went and lived with that family for 6 months when I was 14, which was pretty amazing. And then when I was 19, I lived in London for 6 months and absolutely hated it. And
there must have been even more overstimulating coming from Australia to London than...
I thought I was a big city person in those days, and Brisbane's way too big for me. I'd be quite happier in a smaller city. But then I went from London and then lived in a small town about an hour out of Krakow in Poland for 6 months. I really, really loved it there, but I couldn't really figure out a way to stay. And yeah, I think for a long time I didn't necessarily think I'd end up back in Australia, because I do find, like it's the way this country was built was on colonialism and taking people's land, and there's all these structures of violence that perpetuate that in our culture. And for a long time I found that I didn't quite know what it was. I think as I get older I'm a little bit better able to identify that and go, well, if we want it to change, you have to stay here and try and help in whatever small way you can. So.
And Timor is a place that has also been affected by colonialism in very violent ways. Like what kind of feeling did you get from the people over there as to what relationship they have to their history and where they live?
That's a really interesting question. I ended up doing, in the time that I was living there was a lot of programs on land. So Timor has had Portuguese colonialism, Indonesian occupation, It has its own local laws and governance structures, and then they're creating this state. So there's a lot of kind of conflicting views about land. And the thing that's really amazing about sort of land work as well is you get all that. You can't talk about land without talking about its story. And in Timor, what was really amazing about that experience is that it's effectively an Indigenous culture. And so being in the non-Indigenous minority was really, really interesting. So people will talk about ways of connecting to the land, and someone will have a responsibility to a certain tree. So I had friends who couldn't eat cinnamon, but their job was to make sure that the cinnamon trees were kept healthy and that people weren't taking too much of the bark or weren't hurting them.
When you say they couldn't eat cinnamon, do you mean like they were allergic to cinnamon, or what?
So it was kind of a spiritual connection. So in the culture, different people in a community would have responsibilities to certain trees or certain plants, and they'd also have certain animals that they could or couldn't eat. So if you kind of take the spiritual or sacred aspect out of that, if you imagine you had an entire community living in a particular ecology and some people are responsible for each different plant and each different animal, it's a really smart way of kind of managing the local ecosystem.
And so is that determined on an individual basis, or is it certain groups of people are responsible for certain animals and plants?
Yeah, so it depends on, they call it lulik. So lulik is, I'm sorry, I'm searching for the right word, I can't quite get it. So it's, spiritual power or sort of sacred power. So the whole kind of, if you think of a system of political governance, this is kind of like a system of spiritual governance. So there's very clear rules in the relationships that people have with plants and animals and to each other as well.
What is the demographic breakdown in Timor? Like what percentage are the indigenous population and, I don't know, leftover Indonesians, other Europeans?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure, but overwhelmingly, probably about 95%, I'd say, would be Indigenous population. There is people who have maybe Timorese and Portuguese families, which they call mestizo. A lot of the leaders that people in Australia might be familiar with, Shona Guzmão or José Ramos Horta, they sort of come from that background. Then with the Indonesian, it also really depends. I think a lot of Australians kind of assume that Timorese people would hate Indonesian people. And it really, my experience really wasn't like that. People were much more like, well, we don't like the Suharto system and we don't like the system of violence, but people are very astutely aware of like this was a system that was disadvantaging everyone. And, Timor's an island, so technically half of it's Indonesia and part of it's Timor-Leste. So, but yeah, overwhelmingly Indigenous. Yeah, and there's, I think, over 33 different language groups. Yeah.
And that's the other thing. I mean, like, how could you ask someone if, do you hate the Indonesians when Indonesia is such an incredibly culturally and ethnically diverse country of itself?
Yeah, and if you're standing in Dili, basically you'll see, if you look out at the water, you'll see 3 islands. And the one to your left is, I think, Alor. The one to your right is Weta. And then the one straight ahead is Ataworo. And the one straight ahead is part of Timor and the other 2 are part of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. So it's, yeah, and the connections between those islands themselves obviously go back a really long way too.
So Craig, when you came to Timor, like what were your first impressions? Had you lived overseas before?
No, I'd never lived overseas before, and the only place I'd travelled to had been India, and I hadn't done much travel at all. That was only like 2.5, 3 weeks or something like that. So I hate flying, so I got on the plane and was freaking out, and was, because it was so tiny, and then sat down and I was talking to this guy who was a pilot with the UN, and then he said, I'm really glad that we're on the big plane today. And then I was like, oh my God, this is the big plane. You've got to be kidding me. And then flying over into Timor, I was really taken by what I now know are rivers, like riverbeds. But there are all these kind of white, for want of a better way to describe it, they kind of look like scars on the sides of mountains and hills and this type of thing. And I didn't quite know what they were, but there was a large river that comes out of Dili, isn't it, like the Comoro River? And during the dry season, it's quite a narrow river and it's quite tiny, but there are lots of white rocks all around it, if you know what I mean. So like it's almost like the riverbed is about 5 times bigger than the actual river during the dry season. But during the wet season, that entire thing is river. And so that's what I was seeing as I was flying in over the mountains, so that the island kind of has a bit of a spine, like the mountains are kind of like a spine. And so flying in over that, I saw these scars and was like really blown away by them. They were quite distinct and really dominated the landscape. And then flew in over Dili, which is on a coastal plain, and so it's flat. But the thing is, it backs right onto mountains, and then it's also on the sea, and the sea is this beautiful turquoisey blue colour that I'd never seen before as well. So I was kind of seeing this green jungle with white scars running through it, and then this flat sort of tiny city on a coastal plain that then kind of opens up onto this beautiful blue sea. That's incredibly flat because it's part of the coral triangle, so it has to get really, really stormy weather before it gets any sort of chop or any waves on it. So it's actually quite flat. So it was almost like this surreal kind of... It was dropping into a different world. It was a totally different world. I didn't quite get that at the time, but there was this kind of surreal element to leaving Australia and dropping into this place that I had no understanding of. I didn't even know these things were rivers, you know. It's like... I think the first thing that I remember is I actually really, really like the smell of Timor. It's got that sweet, tropical smell to it. Like there are other smells as well, but like there's this beautiful kind of tropical smell. And just hearing... Like, I couldn't understand anyone. I couldn't understand any tetum. So everything was confusing. Nothing made any sense. And I kind of really loved it. I was like, wow, I'm here and this is going to be nuts.
How long did it take before you start to understand a bit of the local language?
I still don't. But Shona, the organisation you worked in, Lauhamatuk, you had to speak Tetum in that in that organisation, didn't you?
Yeah, so we were working in... one of the things that we used to do is we'd do like a blog and a bulletin and a website, and so that was all writing in Tetum as well. So I was back in Timor last year, and some of my written Tetum takes a lot more energy than it used to, but it probably took a couple of months. I didn't actually do any lessons. I kind of just like, it's not a grammatically difficult language. It's the social aspects of the, like, you know, some people you'll call auntie and uncle, and other people you have to call senor, senora. That stuff's really tricky to understand, but in terms of the actual grammatical structure, you can pick bits up fairly quickly.
So what work were you doing there?
Well, I didn't do any... I wasn't working when I got there. I didn't have anything lined up. So before I left, I'd been working at Lonely Planet. And so...
What did you do for Lonely Planet?
I did a bunch of contracts for their digital unit. So I was called in... Probably my longest spell was about 3 or 4 months working there, which worked really well for me because I was doing a master's. I was doing creative writing masters. I was, had my own creative practice. But I was kind of doing online editing. I was kind of a jack of all trades. Depends on what sort of project they needed. And so at one point, this is going to make no sense to anyone else, but I was wood chipping for Haystack. So that's what... And literally what had happened was the BBC had purchased Lonely Planet, and they said, hey, you've got all this great, amazing resources. They're all in your books. They're clearly going to all be on computers. You've got very little online presence. Let's give you an online presence. So Haystack was what Lonely Planet called kind of the back end of the program, where they were creating different aspects of their website. They were creating sort of little destination snapshots. So Haystack was kind of like the colloquial name everybody at Lonely Planet gave kind of the program that we used for that.
Right.
So you could go on, at the time, you could go online and you could have a look at Brisbane and then get a whole bunch of different pieces of information about Brisbane. So literally what I was doing was I was using Excel to rip all the information out of Word documents and then convert it into a format that the program that uploaded it onto the website could read.
Okay.
And I had to just edit the information because sometimes it read things incorrectly or whatever. So I was doing that and then went to Timor, and there was the idea that Lonely Planet might need someone to work with the digital unit to do a pilot project on creating some sort of new digital product. So the manager that I had at Lonely Planet and I had agreed that if that were going to happen, she'd get in contact with me about that. And the reason that they were going to maybe use Timor as the pilot was because the two people who set up Lonely Planet, the Wheelers, they came through Timor before coming to Australia in the 70s, and they just fell in love with Timor at the time. So they'd come from England
and it's
kind of
beautiful. I mean, a lot of people don't actually know how, like, Timor is stunning.
Yeah.
Like, it's gorgeous. It's on the Coral Triangle. Like, it's amazing beaches, beautiful forest.
Yeah, so I had no job lined up, but there was the possibility of work, and that all fell through. But that's fine because there was no guarantee of that anyway. So then I ended up... What did I end up doing? I ended up working in a newspaper, bilingual Timorese English newspaper, working with the translators. So trying to train them to translate from Tetum to English. And that was a newspaper called the Dili Weekly. And that project, that kind of working with the translators, that project was funded by the International Centre for Journalists, so the ICFJ. And so I ended up doing a few more projects with the ICFJ across the 2 or 3 years that I was there. And the ICFJ, in Timor at least, was USAID funded. So I ended up sort of kind of working for an organisation funded by the equivalent of AusAid here in Australia, but USAID. And also ended up teaching English at a school. I can't remember what it was called, but teaching English to a lot of bureaucrats in the Timorese government, because obviously they needed Tetum. Often they needed Portuguese as well, because a lot of the laws in Timor are written in Portuguese. Mm. And they were doing a lot of negotiations with people who spoke English as well. So they actually needed a fairly high level of English. So I ended up teaching a lot of bureaucrats in the Timorese government, a bureaucratic level of English, I guess.
And Shona, what specifically was your role when you got to Timor?
I guess like any activist organisation, it's all a little bit loose. So I was working quite closely with a team of, there was 4 of us, but we were part of a larger non-hierarchical collective. So I think there was about 10 people, myself, and I think there was an American there at the time, a Dutchman for brief time, but then all the rest of the staff were Timorese. And so we worked on quite a few different things. So one was the Australian military were in Timor at that time. So the Australian military had two kind of recent presences in Timor. So one was as the Indonesians were retreating.
In 99, yeah.
In 99. And I think in general, Timorese people were, that the Australian soldiers at that time were quite respected, and I haven't actually heard too much negative from that time. But in 2006 in Timor, there'd been an incident where you'd had the police and the military had historic tensions because the military were recruited from resistance fighters and the police were recruited from the previous Indonesia era police. So there's always been a few tensions there.
So they would some of those people have literally been at war with each other previously?
Not so much with the police. But it can be really complex. Like I have a friend, one of my friends, he was a student activist. He was part of the student movement. He was involved a lot of like the on the street protests, and his brother worked for the Indonesian military. And so it's a small island. There's a lot of, everyone knows everyone. There's a lot of like complex relationships. With the police and the military, I don't completely understand the background. There's a lot of Timor that I really don't understand. But basically there'd been an incident with the police and military had been fighting against each other. There was a small kind of, I guess, insurgency that had then fled to the interior. And during that time, about, I think, 100,000 people, the population was about 1.2 million at that time. So about 100,000 people, I think, had left Dili. And so it was this time of like, there wasn't a lot of fighting in terms of shooting or gunshots, but there was a lot of social tension. There was also, there's a lot of complex things in a war of, someone might be pushed onto someone else's land and, how do you cope with the tensions around that? So at that time, Timor had asked the UN to send in an international police presence, and the Australians had said, well, we're sending in our military. And at least our experience was that the Australian military were using it as a training ground. So one of the things that we kind of reported on, or were trying to at least engage with the military on, was they had it still makes me furious today, they had a firing range on a beach about an hour out of Dili. There was no fences. It was an open firing range. And this is near people who'd had extremely traumatic experiences during the war. And they just went in and they'd start, shooting at whatever time. And we went and spoke to local people, and there were fisher folk who were like, well, we can't, normally we'd get in our boats and we'd go this way and we'd go, but we can't do that because we don't know when they're going to be doing live firing. And so some of it was just talking to the military and saying this is absolutely ridiculous, and also talking to the community. So the community, if it was me, I would have been like, this should absolutely stop. This is totally inappropriate. What the community at that point wanted was that they wanted the military not to shoot at certain times. They wanted a form of compensation, which I think ended up being some fishing nets or something quite small. But they basically wanted to be able to have a dialogue with the military about what they were doing. So that was one thing that came up. Another was that under that agreement, it's problematic wherever you have peacekeeping, is that the soldiers or the police aren't under the laws of that country. So what you'd have in the UN is you have this very kind of, you have a system where the UN will go and investigate the UN, but feasibly you might have soldiers from one country investigating soldiers from the other country. And so what happened with the Australian military in the time that we were there is that you'd have Australian military who were off duty, who might be driving a car, and then they hit someone and they kill them, and then 2 hours later the Australian military investigates, and then they said, no, we're not at fault here. And that's it. That's all you can do. And then if the compensation process at that time was you could apply for compensation for things. So if someone knocked you off your motorbike, you could apply for compensation for your motorbike, which through a complex system the Australian military would approve and then the Timorese government would pay. But if you were knocked off your motorbike and had an injury, which meant that you couldn't work, as happened for some people, then you didn't get any compensation for loss of income. And if you're in a culture where you might have one or two people who are helping to support, a large extended family, that was just catastrophic, particularly in rural areas. And so, part of what we were doing was also, that was kind of a very minor bit of what I was doing, but that was something I was quite passionate about. I guess the bigger picture was a lot of the stuff around land. So you'd have these technical programs where you'd have someone come in who might not necessarily speak the language, drafting the foundation of the law. Like, so anything got to do with property law. You might have someone who was like 24, didn't speak the language. They'd have a 3 or 4 month project, and then they'd kind of copy and paste from Portugal and then say, hey, this is the new civil code. Or there was also a lot of challenges around, in somewhere with a really complex history, anywhere that you have land, you can't come up with a system of deciding what's fair if there's overlapping claims that everyone's going to be happy with. But what's really important is that you have some principles for how you guide that process. So in Timor, a thing that people talk about on the ground is that, okay, the most important thing is that people have land for their daily needs. So that should be the priority. And then what we saw happening was that you'd have some of these USAID programs or other programs, and they'd say, well, what we think is the most important thing is economic development. And so, there was this, we did a lot of monitoring and analysing of what that process was and trying to feed that information into civil society groups so that, they're like, hey, there's this law being drafted which has the potential to affect everyone's land rights in the entire country. Do you know about this? Has anyone spoken to you about this? At one stage, sitting with basically all the legal experts in the country at that time on land, and saying, hey, this draft law, in this scenario, who would get land, and people not actually being able to tell you. So there was some really kind of alarming stuff about that. But at the same time, it was also a really huge learning ground because I hadn't really thought about land very much at all before I got there. And then actually coming back to Australia afterwards and just being like, it's really weird that you can be a citizen of a place and actually have no legal right to have somewhere to sleep or somewhere to maybe, plant some food. It's really strange. And I think Timor was a huge learning ground on a lot of that stuff.
Did you find, your group, which was sort of a go-between between all these different stakeholders, like the local people, militaries, government, all that, what was their reaction to your group as this intermediary? Did they respect you always?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's like any civil society, there's always really complex roles that people play. And so when you spend a lot of your time working, talking to the World Bank or talking to government, it's also really important that you work closely with people who spend a lot of their time with communities, and that's a really important way of keeping you honest. So a lot of what we did was working as part of a network of about 25 different organisations that all worked on land, and that included some amazing groups that in 2000 there were basically foreigners who went into the highlands of these coffee growing regions where land had been taken during Portuguese times or Indonesian times and turned into these coffee plantations. And basically they've been working with farmers, and then the farmers themselves have taken on that work of basically reoccupying those coffee plantations. And they're going back through the history and they're like, well, whose land is this and why, how did this person get land? Oh, because they spoke Portuguese and they signed something and they got a piece of paper. Why do these people say it's their land? Oh, because they have these stories which are going back thousands or tens of thousands of years. And so, that was an important group that, they would see what we were doing and they'd be like, well, actually, you need to involve farmers in this way, and you need to share that information in a way that you're not trying to speak on anyone else's behalf. And you don't always get that balance right. Sometimes you do have to kind of, our organisation would try to make recommendations. But often that was kind of only if something was going to get passed at very short notice. We'd generally try and say, well, this is the process you should have, and that process should be talking to farmers, talking to women. Yes, but it's a tricky balance, I think.
Craig, was there anything that you found, like that you saw or experienced in Timor that made you like look back at how life is in Australia and think, wow, that's weird, like what Shona was saying with like land?
Yeah. I would have to say probably the whole thing. And I know that sounds a bit crazy to say that, but what I found, the way I experienced Timor, because I work with words and with language, and kind of like my job, it's my creative practice. For want of a better way to describe it, I create worlds, I write short stories, I write novels, that type of thing. Having to learn another language, so having to learn Tetum, and I'm not very good at it, and I was never particularly great at it, because a lot of the work that I did, whether it was my creative practice or even in some of the places I worked, we spoke predominantly English, or I was teaching English, or however that manifested. But having to exist in this place that used a different language meant that the world, if you like, was constructed differently, because the language was different and the grammar was different, and the way in which tense was used or not used was actually quite different. So I ended up thinking in a completely different way because of the impact of the language and the way I had to think to navigate Dili or another city in Timor, Baucau or Los Palos. So sure, I was navigating these geographies that were different, but I was also navigating my brain in a different way and words and language in a different way.
And that different way, did it make more sense to you than the way we do it in Australia?
Well, not so much whether it made more or less sense, but it just meant that I had to think about everything completely differently. So I ended up thinking about Australia differently. Not necessarily from an outsider's perspective, but from a perspective of
knowing that there is another perspective, another way of approaching everything.
Yeah, knowing that there are other ways of understanding the world, there are other knowledges, there are other encyclopedias, there are other ways of having knowledge, making knowledge, conveying knowledge. And so that kind of context just blew my mind completely open, so that I was learning a lot about Timor, but I was learning a lot about the archipelago and Indonesia. And then I learnt a lot about Australia just through learning how these really, really different places and societies and understandings exist kind of pretty close to where we are. And of course, for thousands of years, the people on this continent and the people on the archipelago have been communicating and travelling between the continent and the archipelago and islands and that type of thing. So just having to understand the world in a different way was really wonderful and allowed me to understand Australia in a different way. And something else that I really, really loved, and I'm just going to use a very, very kind of maybe a crass way to explain this, or a very, I don't know if this is simplistic, but something that I really loved about Timor is it is actually this in-between place. And so in Asia, for example, they have monkeys. There are monkeys in Indonesia on the archipelago. Obviously, as we know, here in Australia, we don't have monkeys, but we have possums. Timor has both. So Timor exists in this place, Australasia or whatever you want to call this continent, and Asia and the archipelago kind of overlap. And so some parts of Timor-Leste look like the northern parts of Australia, and they have native eucalypts over there. And so, as I said, getting my head around this other language and this other way of looking at the world, but also getting my head around this idea of how Timor sits in this really, really special spot in the globe, in the world, that is actually kind of beautifully halfway between these two really different geographies and different cultures was, yeah, it was actually, I found it really gorgeous and beautiful. And I think even though I was the one, when we left, I was the one who identified that we had to leave because I was getting quite frustrated at certain things that were happening in Timor, and I didn't want to be one of those people who hated Timor but was still living there for some unknown reason. I don't know. We met a few of those people who would talk Timor down, but it's like, well, you're still living here and working here. What's the go?
There was also some people using different language to be incredibly racist as well. That was one of the things that was a big part of the international community too.
So I didn't want to end up being one of them. So I was actually the one who had to leave. But as we were pulling out onto Comoro Road on the way to the airport, I was the one who started crying as we left Timor, even though I wasn't the one who got the job there. I wasn't the one who was, committed to going there necessarily in the beginning. So I had this it wasn't even a love-hate relationship with Timor, but it was very much that I knew I had to leave, but I also didn't want to leave at the same time.
You were together in Timor 18 months into your relationship, moving overseas and living overseas and experiencing, this whole new way of living and being and thinking. Was that challenging, being in a relatively new relationship?
I don't know. I wouldn't know what it was like if it was I don't know.
I actually found I found coming back was the hardest bit. So
You had incredible culture shock for ages when we came back.
I get really extreme culture shock, and then also I'm not a commitment phobe, but I was sort of asking Craig when we're leaving. So, should we live together back in Australia, or should we get a share house near each other? Or Craig's like, of course we're going to live together. What? I'm like, oh yeah, because in Timor it wasn't really a choice. It was sort of, culturally, it was probably more appropriate just to live together like a married couple. Kind of made sense logistically, and but I think it was actually coming back. I was quite lost for a while.
For ages, for a long time, months and months and months, yeah.
Yeah, and because I think, in Timor, I'm an outsider and I'll always be an outsider. But when you were talking before, Craig, about, the links between Indonesia and Timor and this continent and how people see the world and how people structure things, when you've seen that, colonial settler culture is really weird. It's just really, really weird. And so how you come back, and it's also the culture I grew up with. So how you go, that's familiar and I like that. And, it's okay to engage with these parts of Australia, and then how you have the other bits which are okay, that's more problematic. I find that really tough.
But I think that was also the beautiful thing, what I was also touching on but didn't quite articulate before, is that familiarity of this place, of Australia, became so completely unfamiliar to me through being exposed to that different way of thinking. And I really, really love that. So it enabled me, or at least I hope so, to be able to critique this country's structures a little bit better and a little bit more, and how I end up navigating this country is actually quite different. Not necessarily different from the way I navigated it before leaving Timor, but with that added knowledge and that added understanding of how other people do see the world. I've actually got another tool or another couple of tools to navigate this world here in Australia, which has forever been, for me, has consistently since I was early teenager been so monumentally bamboozling to me. Like, and I guess maybe that was the thing. Like, sure, Timor was bamboozling, but I'm used to being bamboozled by cultures because this one doesn't necessarily sit that particularly easily with me either. So,
To that end, would you want to live overseas again to get yet another perspective?
well, we haven't necessarily even talked about it, but I wouldn't say no to that. But like, you know, we've kind of generally sort of said Indonesia could be really interesting. Indonesia could be cool to live in, but there's no plans. There's nothing like that. I don't know about you. If you'd live, you'd live overseas again?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would probably be, yeah, I think the place would be really important. So,
Jakarta, you're down with that?
yeah, no way.
Too big.
No, too big, too big. If someone said, hey, you can live in, someone has a job for you and you can live in a beautiful rural town somewhere, that would be pretty enticing. Yeah, I don't know if it's kind
Sydney.
of. Yeah, it's not on the cards, but it's not off the table, to mix metaphors. But I have gone back and forth from Timor quite a bit. So I spent 3 months there last year, and then so that's kind of a little bit like a second home as well. So
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Like Timor, yeah, you've spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards between Timor since we came back in at the end of 2010.
I think part of it is creating a relationship with the place. Like, I think it is easy to live and work somewhere and not necessarily speak the language very much, or not, to be there for 6 months and then move on and leave. And I think if we were going to live overseas, it would want to be somewhere that we'd sort of be able to have a longer term relationship with.
Which we were trying with Timor. Like, when we first moved to Timor, we were committed to 5 years. But then when I felt that I had to leave because I was becoming the person, I didn't want to become the person who hated the place. So that's why we ended up only being about 3 years.
But I think part of it for you too is, I mean, you've talked about the jobs you were doing, but basically you're a writer. That's what you do. And Timor's an oral culture. And so you didn't have the same, you connected with musicians and visual artists, and, you'd see kind of Craig and, the people at the art school there kind of like gravitate towards each other like magnets, but it wasn't the same writing community as what you have in Australia. And I think that was the bit that you were just really missing. And the other things were kind of an expression of this really important part of you not being able to be fulfilled in that way.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of that too was I wasn't fluent, being an oral culture. I wasn't fluent in the language. I struggled. I never learnt a second language as a kid, so I was in my mid-30s when we moved. So I was trying to learn a second language for the first time in my mid-30s, and I'm not actually very good at second languages. I've subsequently found out I'm all right at English, but having said that too, like, I mean, all those experiences have completely and utterly influenced my writing. And so it's not even necessarily the fact that I'm writing a novel at the moment, looking at Australia and looking at the continent, and the idea of the novel is that there are a number of different countries on this continent, and exploring what that would mean, and if we've got, different countries and borders and customs and different cultures and different languages running around on the continent, because, like, we did have that, like this idea that it's only English. So kind of exploring that idea, but a lot of the stuff that's being thrown into that kind of alternate history of the continent has come from my experiences in Timor. So I've been able to throw it into my creative practice as well, rather than say writing a non-fiction piece about Timor or something like that, because like there are Timorese people who are far more qualified to do that than I am. But so there has been that cross-pollination there as well, which I really, really love. So writing this novel is kind of, I imagine a scene and I can imagine being in Dili sometimes, or I did do a little bit of travel into Indonesia while we were over there. So did you as well. So yeah, I can drop myself back into some of these places while I'm writing as well.
So it's an alternate history novel?
Yeah, it's kind of an alternate future magical realist novel.
So in the alternate future, are these different countries on the Australian continent, like are they Indigenous Australian countries, or are they, is it as if there was no colonisation in the 18th century?
It's both. So
You're blowing my mind, Craig.
There is a southern province of Indonesia on the continent.
Right.
There is the form of Australia that we have now, for want of a better way to describe it, the white Australia we have now, but it hugs the southern part of the continent. And then there is an Indigenous territory made up of different Indigenous nations that sits to the northeast of the continent as we have it. So, yeah, so I'm exploring at the moment my characters. I was just explaining this to someone the other night. At the moment, my characters are currently on a bunch, like a herd of camels. They're riding camels west in the Indonesian province of Java Nusa Agung, and they're heading towards some mountains on the edge of what we would call the Western Australian desert at the moment, that have been terraformed by the Indonesian government. So Indonesia has created these mountains, and in the mountains is a town or a city called Majapahit, and Majapahit is an ancient Tamil kingdom that came out from what we would currently call southern India, and came out across and ended up coming probably about halfway across the Indonesian archipelago. And so there were a number of different Hindu cities, and that's how Bali has remained Hindu, whereas a lot of the other dominant religions around Indonesia haven't necessarily been Hindu. So, yeah, my characters are riding camels up some mountains that have been created by the Indonesian government to go to an ancient kingdom from India.
Cool.
Yeah. Which has got nothing to do with Timor necessarily, but trying to bring the different ideas of the influences that have occurred on this continent pre-1788 as well. Like, there is evidence that the continent has been influenced by a number of different peoples and religions and trade from the archipelago.
So when you came back from Timor, did you have anything lined up?
No, we didn't, did we? Or did we?
I had a little contract.
Oh, you did, yeah.
I had a little contract through a university that was actually working with a network in the Pacific called the Pacific Asia Network on Globalization, and they do a lot of advocacy about trade agreements. And they were negotiating a trade agreement between the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. And so we were working with them to do a bit of research into how a proposed trade agreement might affect food sovereignty in the Pacific. So we were kind of partnering up, and we were bringing, some of the nerdy side of knowing some of the language of trade agreements and how they work on agriculture, and linking with them who know the local stuff. But through that work, 5 days from coming back to Australia, I ended up at an academic conference that the conference centre in Gippsland had more infrastructure than Dili at that time, and I was in profound culture shock.
You were, yeah, and I actually ended up getting a scholarship to do a PhD. So yeah,
That's right. Yeah, you had that lined up, didn't you? Yeah.
I didn't know about it. I found out about it when we got back, but I'd applied for it while we were in Timor.
Yeah.
And then found out about it, I think, in the December.
Yeah.
When we got back. So yeah, so yes, you had a little bit of work lined up that actually led to some other craziness and culture shock, and you ended up travelling to Fiji also not long after we got back, and then I kind of got a scholarship to do a PhD.
Right. So you came back to Melbourne when you came back to Australia?
Yeah.
We knew we were going to move to Meanjin, like Brisbane. But we wanted to spend 6 months with family and friends that we hadn't seen for a while. So we were there temporarily, but we always knew it was going to be temporary.
What made you want to come to Brisbane? Are you two from Brisbane originally?
No.
No. What made you want to come here then?
Melbourne's really cold and grey.
And Timor's just way too hot.
And so Darwin would have been a good place to go, but that's way too hot as well.
So yeah, we basically kind of looked at the continent and then drew a line, and
Brisbane was halfway between.
Brisbane
the
was
two?
kind of halfway.
Yeah, Brisbane was kind of halfway, and it worked out incredibly well. But yeah, there was not really much strategy.
No,
No.
there wasn't. I just knew I could never be cold again. And Melbourne gets grey. We were talking about this the other day. Like, Melbourne's really, really grey. I grew up in Canberra, and even in the middle of winter, you can get sunny days and blue sky. Melbourne, it just doesn't feel like that happens, and that sends me pretty stir crazy.
And it's also really big. Like,
Oh yeah, and you don't like it because Melbourne's too big.
yeah, Brisbane's too big, so Melbourne was just way too big.
How did you get involved in 4ZZZ?
I'd been doing community radios in Melbourne since 2003. I didn't really do any radio in Timor, but I've always loved radio. So I didn't quite get involved in 4ZZZ as soon as we moved here. I was doing some other things. I think part of it was also doing the PhD. Like, there's a lot of time involved. It was a creative writing PhD, but there's a lot of time involved in doing the academic side of the creative writing PhD. So I find that for me, I can do both, the academic and the creative work, but the academic work seems to take a lot more time. For me, it takes a lot more brain space. So it wasn't until I actually got rid of the PhD, I did not finish it, I just decided I was not going to complete it, that I kind of, my kind of psychological space had room in it to go back to radio. And I really love doing pre-recorded stuff. I love the kind of playing and experimenting and that type of thing, which I didn't quite do back when I started with 3CR in Melbourne. Everything I did was live. Like, I did all this live sort of stuff. So I actually didn't have any copies of anything that I'd ever done. And so it's the change in technology that the digital aspect of the technology and the playing and the pre-recording and that sort of thing. I just got really excited by that. So came back to radio and came back to the news.
I think you were also at a point where you were, writing all day, every day is quite a solitary endeavour. And I think part of it too was that you were looking for more of a community connection as well.
Yeah.
And you tried a few different things, and it seemed like 4ZZZ was really, you found your peeps sort of thing.
Yeah, I've found different pockets of peeps with it. I did also, I guess part of this journey, I did start doing parkour at the age of 40 as well. So it's kind of like, which does seem to be it's a young person's game, that parkour. So I guess part of it is too, I'm quite open for different experiences to a degree, and so I do love radio. I really do love it, and I love being able to play with it as well, like to experiment in different aspects.
And Shona, how come you got involved?
I really love radio. Like, I'm very passionate about kind of particularly podcasts and all different forms.
I was going to say, you were listening to podcasts before they were called podcasts.
Yeah, I think before I met Craig. So, yeah, someone who I was dating before Craig, he was based in the States. And so he got me into this American life in, I think, about 2005 or something. So it was really weird. I was always like that person who'd turn up to like dinner parties, and I'd be talking about this thing that I was listening to on a podcast, and people would be like, yeah, whatever that is. And then now it's like, oh my goodness, they've exploded. We can all talk about podcasts together. It's excellent. So part of it was I just really love radio and I love the form. I also just get really excited about hearing different, when you're younger, you're often thrown into situations where you're meeting people who are different from you. And as you get older, it's very easy to just hang out with people who are like you. And so the radio I get really excited about is being able to hear different people or different people's stories, or even just physically different voices from what you hear in day-to-day life. It's pretty powerful. And then 4ZZZ was running the Women on the Edge program. So that was really amazing. I think it went for about 4 months in 2017. And there was a whole heap of really, really amazing women and non-binary folk who were doing that program from all different backgrounds. And through that we kind of made our first radio pieces and everything went from there.
Yeah, so you made 1.4 square kilometres.
I did.
Which was shortlisted for the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia Awards, Documentary Awards last year, wasn't it?
Why, you just fit that in so smoothly, Craig. That was pretty amazing because I do a lot of research. Actually doing a lot of that research is going to other places and looking at quite complex things. And doing the documentary, I spent a lot of time just hanging out in Fortitude Valley and realising this place that I thought I knew pretty well, I actually didn't. There was all these different stories and different things happening that I had no idea about. So that was pretty amazing.
And so what else because you don't have a regular show that you do at Triple Z, what other stuff have you been doing there besides Woodford, which is where we met?
Yeah, so I started on Saturday Brisbane Line, and there I came on board. There were 2 other people, and they were doing uni. They were students. So over the course of a few months after I started, they both got jobs as journalists and left. So then I ended up doing Saturday Brisbane Line on my own for about 6 months, and then a woman named Lucy Chavinsky came on board, and we did it together for about 2 years, Brisbane Line. And yeah, that was turning up every Saturday and doing an hour-long show. And we, at the end of last year, we left. We both, I don't know that we burnt out, but we weren't as energetic and weren't as passionate and weren't as focused on it as we could have been. And we both realised that, so we actually both left. And Lucy's gone off and she's editing her university's student magazine now, which is going to be a full-time job. And that's taken all her focus. And I've got some work with the Queensland Poetry Festival. So I recorded, I don't know how many hours of tape I recorded last year at the festival. And I've just created a whole bunch of, I don't even know what they are, like products, if for want of a better way to describe it, of a raft of panels and performances that they did at the festival. So I've recorded all them and done pretty much all post-production, done all them, gone through, cleaned up the levels, cleaned up some of the audio. There are a couple of places where I was recording that I got really, really terrible audio, so I had to spend a lot of time kind of cleaning that up for consumption. And what I will be doing is creating a soundscape using a number of the different performances and music and kind of trying to weave them together. And so I did that in 2017, and so I'll be doing that for last year's festival, 2018. It's just that it's taken me a long time to actually edit all the tape that I got.
It's too interesting. That's the problem with that festival.
Yeah. There's just so much stuff there. So I've been doing that. I've also been working with Kim Stewart on a project where we went into a supported accommodation unit in South Brisbane with a number of different men who have been homeless, and they're transitioning from homelessness to independent living, but they're able to get sort of this supported accommodation through Ozcare, and we've been working with them and getting their stories and taking their stories and doing a series of documentaries about those men and the issues they have hit in their lives and the issues and obstacles that they've overcome in order to try and end up being independent again. So a number of people have had mental health, substance abuse issue, like really intense stuff and some trauma as well, and ended up on the streets, and how these stories of how they're actually getting off the streets as well. And I've done a couple of radio documentaries also, and I'm still currently editing one. The one I'm editing, I did a lot of recording for it last year, I just haven't had time to do it yet, is a documentary about the Cat Muscat Fellowship. So Cat Muscat was a young writer and editor, and a couple of years ago she passed away when she was still quite young, and her former employer Express Media, which publishes the literary journal VoiceWorks, which is a youth-focused literary magazine. Cat Muscat used to edit VoiceWorks, and so Express Media and Cat's family have put together a fellowship that supports young female and non-binary and female identifying writers and editors early on in their career, and gives them a little bit of a stipend and support and publishing contacts for 12 months. And so the fellowship supports these women to write and to edit.
And Bree Lee came out on that, didn't she?
Yeah, doing different projects. So Bree Lee published Eggshell Skull last year, and she was the first recipient of the Cat Muscat Fellowship, and Bree's book looked at the prejudice within our judicial systems, because she worked as a judge's clerk for 12 months after finishing her law degree, and she found that the way in which women were contextualised and treated in the judicial system is quite sexist and undermines the idea of fair legal representation, or fairness in justice, or fairness in the actual system.
I remember that book coming through at work now, actually, yeah.
Yeah. So she was the first Cat Muscat Fellowship recipient. So many years ago, I edited VoiceWorks as well. So that's how I got interested in the fellowship and losing a fellow editor. I'd met Kat a few times. I'd followed her career. And so for her to pass away at such a young age was actually quite... it had a fairly major impact on Australia's literary culture. And so a number of people I know are still struggling. Like, that was a few years ago now. They're still struggling, might not be the right word, but they're still grappling with the loss of that person, and the loss of... Part of it is also maybe the loss of the potential of that person in the literary sphere of this country. But so pretty amazing for her family and her former employer to come together and create this quite amazing, wonderful fellowship. It's quite a wonderful way to actually celebrate the life of a person.
And what was her 3-word slogan?
Oh, I can never remember the actual...
The order. Yeah.
Defiance, feminism, empathy is the 3 words. Maybe not in that order.
What an amazing compass to guide you through life. That's incredible.
Shona, what are you doing at Z at the moment?
I've been doing just a few things for Brisbane Line. So a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Harper Nielsen, who is amazing. She was the 9-year-old girl who she was in the media last year because she refused to stand for Advance Australia Fair. So I actually got quite nervous before the interview. Like, I was doing a phone interview and Craig's like, "You realise she's 9?" I'm like, "But she's so cool." So that was great. And Yeah, so I've been also doing a few, just this year, done a few little bits and pieces with kids as journalists, which I think is amazing. Just that, I remember being a kid and having very strong opinions about things and a really strong sense of right and wrong. And so it's really awesome to see some young journalists coming up in that way. But yeah, I guess another thing I've kind of, I think my contract at work should be up about mid-year this year, and one of the things a story that I looked into last year was the City of Brisbane Investment Corporation, and I'd like to do a bit more digging into that. So basically Brisbane City Council, Ipswich City Council, a whole heap of South East Queensland city councils have set up companies that then act as developers, basically. So some of the corruption that was linked to Ipswich City Council was through their investment arm. I got really interested in it in Fortitude Valley because it's a pretty, Fortitude Valley is pretty packed, and you had this area of so-called unused land. And instead of kind of going, hey, let's talk to the community and see what people need, let's look at urban planning, how many people are moving into the area, they kind of use this investment arm as a way of just, basically having that land passed on to developers. One chunk of land, there was no public tender, there was no public consultation. It's not even clear who's actually bought the land. So there's some real transparency concerns around that. When I started reporting on that story, maybe 18 months ago, they wouldn't even publish their annual reports. So yeah, trying to chip away at that. But that's probably the next deep dive that I'll do. You've also been doing podcasting workshops too, Craig.
I have been doing podcasting workshops for the Queensland Writers Centre. So I've done one and I've got another one coming up. But the other thing I also do is I still do stuff for 3CR. So there's a nationally syndicated workplace relations, industrial relations union show called Stick Together. And so I'm kind of like the Queensland correspondent. So once a month I do an interview about some sort of workplace issue, industrial relations issue, union issue. So I interviewed people outside McDonald's. I don't know if you heard about this, but there was the protest outside McDonald's. McDonald's was looking at stopping people from taking toilet breaks and drinks breaks. And I interviewed some people about that at the front of that. But yeah, Stick Together is actually a pretty amazing little show, and it's on Wednesdays. It's half an hour, but they pack a lot in, and certainly talking about the bigger and broader sort of workplace and industrial relations issues.
And you also pass those stories on to Brisbane Line as well.
I do, yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll do some radio work together again. But thank you so much for coming to do my podcast with me.
No, that's okay. Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks.
If you want to hear some of Shona and Craig's radio work, Shona's radio documentary 1.4 Square Kilometres is up on her SoundCloud page. Just Google Shona Hawke's SoundCloud. And Craig is a sometime contributor on the program Stick Together on Melbourne's 3CR network. That's on Wednesdays 8:30 to 9 a.m. at 8:55 on the AM band in Melbourne. Or if you're not in Melbourne, you can stream episodes at 3cr.org.au/sticktogether. Minor correction for this episode. Defiance, feminism, empathy was the phrase tattooed on the arm of the writer and editor Kat Muscat. It provided the theme for many articles and tributes written in the wake of Kat's death in 2015 at the age of 25. Last year, a collection of Kat's writings was published by Express Media under the title Defiance, Empathy, Feminism. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, there are 52 more just like it. Actually, that's not true. They're not really like this one. Most of them have local musicians on it. But I've got a few lined up, actually, with people who are not musicians, or at least that's not their main thing we'll be talking about. Anyway, more episodes in the pipeline. Do subscribe if you like this one. And you can like and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Gimme Empathy Podcast, or send me an email at gimmeempathypodcast@gmail.com. I will see you next time. Well, I'm not going to see you. You'll hear me next time. Until then, stay encased. Sure. Yep.